Dr. Kojo Busia. Dr. Busia is currently the Chief of Natural Resource Management Section, Division of Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. From 2014 to 2019, he served as the coordinator of the African Mineral Development Center, a Pan-African Center of Excellence charged with the implementation of the African Mining Vision and African Union Policy Initiative for Sustainable Mineral Resource Development. While working primarily in the policy and regulation aspect of the mining sector, Dr. Busia has equal skills, expertise, and experience in the economics, environmental, social, and governance sustainability dimension of mining companies and their supply chain. I think the timing is excellent to have you, Dr. Busia, as a speaker. As we just saw, the next wave of growth is coming. To me, there's no doubt. And often when there's growth and there's infrastructure growth and there's need for material, it's done in a very quick way. And we've seen that in Africa, in different countries, where the need for the material, was way, the priority was much greater than the ESG needs. And it can happen that it's not done properly. So I turn it over to you. Your pedigree is amazing, and the timing to have you as a speaker is excellent. Dr. Busia.
Thank you, Benoit, and also let me thank NOLA and the Canadian Council of Africa for inviting me to be a part of this timely webinar. As you put it, I'm very pleased to be speaking on behalf of the Economic Commission for Africa. First, let me also take this opportunity to thank the Canadian government for its leadership role over the years in supporting Africa in developing its natural resources over the years. Indeed, if you have been following, Canada has been a major partner in African mineral resource development, having contributed over the last 10 years to the setting up of the African Mineral Development Center, which was housed in UNECA and which I was privileged to have led over the last 5 years. The center is now an African Union flagship center, which is now taken over by the African Union Secretariat in Addis Ababa. When we talk about mining, of course, Canadian mining companies are major players in the African continent, whether you're talking about major mining companies like Kinross and others, but also a host of other junior mining companies that are taking the risk in terms of mining exploration and also development of world-class mining assets throughout the continent. In fact, about 60% of equity financing for mining exploration do come from Canada, from publicly listed companies that come from Canada. So Canada is a major investor in African minerals, particularly in the upstream exploration phase. And of course, in most of the other sectors, which Zemedeneh had already mentioned, Canada is a player and indeed it has a presence in terms of trade and investment in Africa. And if you think about the post-COVID period, in fact, we do expect that Canada's role will be pivotal in terms of shaping the new paradigm that is emerging in the post-COVID period in Africa. I think my focus is on supply chains because of all the things that have happened with COVID on the economic side. I think the most visible impact of COVID on the global economy is the fragmentation and the seemingly devastating impact it's had on global supply chains. And of course, if you talk about supply chains, the sector of natural resources, indeed all sectors, but also natural resource sector has been hardly hit. The global attention has been focused rightly on the medical sector, the pharmaceutical medical sector, with concern to PPEs and the shortages that have been registered due to disruptions in the supply chains of PPEs, but I think all sectors are equally impacted within the global supply chains being concentrated, essentially in China. Now, one of the examples of the sectors is the car manufacturing sector, the electronics as well, but also, as I mentioned, the mining sector. The point being that most of the manufacturing or processing plants have been closed as a result of the breakdown in the supply chain, therefore causing constraints to the distribution of supplies that are critical to the operations of most of the mines across the continent. The lockdowns, as we have witnessed, have impaired smooth operations of mining sites in several jurisdictions across the continent. And this has affected countries differently. Some jurisdictions are more impacted than others, but by and large, we have seen that some of these are affecting mining operations. Mining is a unique sector because it's a 24/7-hour sector, and any kind of stoppage in operations have a major impact in terms of operational risk to mining sector meeting targets of production and so on. But I think by and large, as I said, depending on the jurisdiction that the mines are located, we have had a relatively well-managed disruption of the supply chains on this sector. And in fact, some of them have sort of, depending on the regulations that the mining, the governments in these jurisdictions have put in place to manage COVID-19, we've had sort of a fairly well-managed supply sector that, supply chains to the issues that we are talking about. Typically, you have supplies like the ties, spare parts, other mineral processing inputs like the chemicals and some of those consumables in the sector that usually runs out due to short sort of time frame for stockpiling that have been affected. The issue of climate change, which is also linked to my presentation, comes in because the kinds of supply shortages that we are witnessing is similar to the climate change caused supply chain constraints that we are bound to face in the future. Obviously, extreme weather conditions creates disruptions that are almost identical, if not the same, to the smooth operations of supplies globally. So the anticipation of climate-caused events that will create shortages must be factored in terms of what kinds of resilience that we build and what kinds of strategies that African governments will have to devise in the future in terms of preventing some of these problems that we've had. But let's look at the responses that most governments have tried to come up with a view towards imagining the future of how this would look like. And here I'm proposing here, and I think most observers, and I think the speakers before me alluded to the fact that globally, across the globe, I think the reaction to COVID-19 in terms of this huge, massive impact on supplies is the ultimate outcome would be the fragmentation of supply chains. And rightly so, not in a negative sense, but at least the regionalization and the localization of supplies across all sectors. So the point here is that any future strategies or shift in paradigm must focus on how do we create sustainable, dependable, resilient mining supply chains within the African economies. And some of these things have already been alluded to by Zemedeneh already. So the next slide, please. So overall, the responses that have come across Africa in terms of mining companies reacting to the supply chain breakdown have fallen into threefold. One is the immediate response of how do you manage, particularly with regard to the workforce in terms of the mine site. Taking into consideration some of the restrictions that are put in place, the lockdowns the governments have implemented. How do you react to that, and how do you manage that? Which also bears on the issues of the environment, social, and governance issues, which is extremely important to any reputable mining companies. And of course, closely linked to that is how do you manage supply chains resilience themselves? What strategies do you have? How do you adjust your strategy so that you're able to do what trade-offs are necessary in the medium to long term so that you can better manage for any future? And thirdly, the discussion has already begun in various quarters among stakeholders as to how do you reimagine supply chains in Africa over the long term, and some of which have already been discussed by the speakers before me. But an immediate response basically it's the issue of protecting your health, the health of your workforce, the issues of PPPs, mining companies directly engaging in procuring personal protection equipment, making sure that the compliance with the social distances requirements and lockdowns requirements that are being put in place by host governments, and actually going beyond that in terms of supporting communities to manage also the health, and with regard to some of the issues of water, sanitation, hospitals or clinics, and even the provision of electricity and others that will help the immediate community, but also the larger society at large. And I think this is extremely important because, as we all know, over the last few years, and again, the issue of climate change comes very close because the investor activism with regard to ESG has been extremely unusual. And this is even pre-COVID, in a sense that companies that do not pay sufficient attention to the ESG matters will be the losers overall. That performance ratings in ESG in the long term contributes to companies' sustainability. So the response to the COVID crisis has been tremendous on the part of mining companies, and in terms of supporting communities at large, meeting all these basic necessities, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, all of this with a view towards securing their social licenses to operate. Sorry, I was disconnected. So basically, companies have responded tremendously well, and I think this is the future trend that we are going to be seeing, not just with COVID, but even in the post-COVID era. One of the commentators that came out after the COVID experience with regard to the ESG is that your performance during the COVID crisis will come back to haunt you in the post-COVID era when you try to access capital. So this is a very important point, particularly for Canadian companies that are involved in the natural resource sector. But very quickly, in terms of the resiliency, in terms of managing resilience of the supply chains, I think companies are increasingly sort of trying to balance the trade-off. Do we have a short-term sourcing of supply chains outside the local economy, or do we start now to see what are the options available locally? There is enough evidence to suggest that in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, mining companies, especially jurisdictions that have more than one or two mining companies, are getting together with local small, medium enterprises to review their procurement strategies and procurement plans with a view towards helping local small suppliers to pool resources together, to giving them better terms of payment in terms of the procurement, and being able to beef up their capacity to supply, given the shortfalls that we are seeing in global supply chain. So I think this is a very, very good development. We also have other companies who are actually moving away from global supplies and beginning to make contacts with regional suppliers, in terms of trying to prevent such similar shocks in the future. And I think this is a very good development. As I said, supply chains in the local economy is not only good core business, but also has a long-term benefit, not only during moments like COVID or emergencies like climate change, but also in the long term, supporting the local economy in the context of companies' ESG record, but also indeed shifting away the focus of host governments, focusing excessively on revenues. One of the things that the African Mineral Development Center has discovered over the years in supporting mining, the mining sector in countries, is because there's limited linkages of the mining operations with the local economy. Host governments tend to focus exclusively on the fiscals. In other words, on the tax revenues, either royalties or corporate taxes, because there's no other linkages that the economy is benefiting from in the context of mining. So developing local supply chains in the long run will help sort of divert some of the extreme focus on revenues coming from the taxation that host government puts on mining, and rather focus on developing local businesses, which then has linkages and other sort of multiplier impacts on other sectors of the economy. So then what happens in the future moving forward? I'm limited with time, so I'm not going to focus too much on what is happening now, but let's look at the future. I think COVID-19 has only confirmed a trend that was already beginning to take shape in Africa with regard to supply chains. Increasingly, I think there's a new paradigm, as I said, that is emerging with regard to how do we develop local supply chains in terms of capacity, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of really having a possibility of linking up local supplies with global supplies through some kinds of investment agreements like joint ventures that would provide opportunity for local value addition. I think Zemedeneh said it correctly, that although the value of investments, FDI in Africa in the natural resource sector is huge, but overall, the value addition is quite limited. Upstream, from exploration to the mines development in terms of construction of the mines, as well as downstream when the commodities are actually extracted. We need to look at all the value chain to see what opportunities exist for African economies to contribute to the value addition, both as suppliers, and that's basically part of your manufacturing sector. Supporting your manufacturing sector. At the end of the day, mining supplies are consumables within the mines themselves. So these are inputs that can easily be manufactured through local plants and processing of basic chemicals and other inputs. And of course, services that can also be sourced locally, increasingly with expertise in Africa. There's a huge inflow of African diaspora skills that are coming in. So right across the value chain, whether it's in the upstream, investment packaging and accounting services, banking services, or midstream, where you need architects and construction engineers that will help develop the mines, but also increasingly mining engineers and mineral processing engineers. All of these can be sourced locally, or better yet, we need investment structures that will link global expertise with local skills to form viable joint ventures in the service sector, in the mining sector, which has multipliers in all other sectors. So what we are seeing in the post-COVID world, indeed, in the context of climate change, the imperative of climate change will continue to be present. And not only in terms of the emergency that it creates and the need to have suppliers and to strategize to be able to avoid such similar events as we've had in COVID-19, but also in the long term, the carbon emission footprints that supply chains, global supply chains have on the continent. Increasingly, all of you in the natural resource sector know, the whole issue of decarbonization in the mining sector is taking hold. And what we are seeing is that what we call scope 3 carbon footprints monitoring, increasingly mining companies have to account for it. And how do you account for it? How do you better perform in your carbon footprints is using local suppliers. And this is part of the entire ESG performance ratings that are going to be imperative to the mining sector. So the argument for building supply chains at the local level is uncontestable. I think COVID-19 has pushed it to the forefront, and I think we need to take it seriously. Lastly, but not least, I want to focus on the battery economy that is emerging. I think Benoit referred to it, that a whole new global economy is emerging, going to be built on clean energy. The energy transition is already here. And African minerals will play a key role in this whole transition to the clean economy. And what we need to do now is to look at it, to what extent can we add value to the local supply chain that would then play a critical role in terms of the African mining sector. If you look at cobalt, lithium, graphite, all these major energy materials or battery minerals are sourced in Africa, but oftentimes with very little, if any, value addition. Yes, indeed, most of the supply chains in the battery industry are now sourced out of China. And it's clear that with COVID-19 and the lessons that we've learned, the shift is going to move away from China to mostly Europe or North America. So what do? We need to have some deconcentration of supply chains in the battery sector. And most of these can become closer to the mining site, which is within Africa itself, where most of the commodities for the battery economy are sourced. So let me wind up here by just saying that the argument for relocating supply chains out of China and other highly concentrated areas is clear. Now, most African governments over the years have put in place local content policies and frameworks so that they can attract investments to be able to participate in the value chains of their mining sector. And the opportunity presented by this, COVID-19 is quite clear. And as I said, the imperative of climate change has all contributed to reconfiguring the dynamics in the landscape of global supply chains. And Africa is ready to host most of the supply, providing supplies to the sector, should be located right closer to the mining sites, both locally, but also within sub-regions. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement also provides a regional framework through which there will be easy mobility of supplies within sub-regions. If you take West Africa, for example, clearly these are opportunities that should not be missed. So I will end up here and we will leave the rest to the Q&A. Thank you.